Welcome to $5 Gaming. Now, quick warning, if you have an allergy to things from Japan, viewer discretion is advised. My hair was brown before I played this game.
Rolling Stone!
Taito, the company that developed such shooters as Space Invaders and Darius Twin, did not make WarTech. G.Rev, a company founded by former Taito employees, did. If that name doesn't sound familiar, two games they co-developed will: Gradius 5 and Ikaruga. The money they made working on those titles led to two arcade shooters, Border Down and Under Defeat, before they made this game, WarTech Senko no Ronde, which can be loosely translated to Polarimetric Rondo, or if you really want to oversimplify it, Dance of Light. It was the first G.Rev game to reach North America, or at least the RevX version of it was. There were 4 versions, 1 update, and Japan-only content on the Xbox Live Marketplace of just this game. That's approaching Street Fighter levels of hawking different versions and content packs of the same game. For the North American version specifically, such updated features included new endings, a new control scheme, a score attack mode, and being able to pick stages and versus Wait, you couldn't do that before?
Full disclosure, I didn't buy this game myself, it was given to me by a friend. But he did leave the price sticker on it, so I can confirm that it was purchased for $5 or less. And it was purchased in Canada, so it's more like $3.80. He also purchased it from the very relevant and still existing Blockbuster Video.
The game starts with some flowery language about Fortana and people fleeing Earth, all of which explains next to nothing. Even after playing through the game with every character, I still had no idea what the hell the story was supposed to be. You might say that's not important, but the developers thought it was important enough to have an in-game encyclopedia with 35 separate entries on the characters, their machines, and even some things I never heard or encountered in either the game or the brief backstories thrown into the instruction book, which includes bios and backgrounds for 3 non-playable characters. So here's what's going on. Something called the Great Disaster happened on Earth that forced everyone to leave for places like the Moon and Mars. No one is allowed to research the Great Disaster, and no one even remembers what it was, presumably because video games and the internet destroyed everyone's attention spans. Or the developers wanted an excuse to not write this part of the backstory. Old world technology such as, and I'm quoting, biology, has been lost. How do you survive in space without knowing what your species needs to survive or is capable of surviving?
Hey Jim, why do we need to wear suits in the cold, empty vacuum of space?
Man, I don't know, Bill. Why don't you go outside without a suit and tell me what it was like?
Alright, I'll be right back.
People eventually go back to Earth, but many stay out in space, and 6 years before this game, a group forcibly took over an embassy on the Moon. After special forces made their way in, the group somehow just became one guy who blew himself up and killed 300 people, including the parents of one of the game's cover boys, Mika Mikli, a member of the Arya Federation's Special Space Service, which I don't know what exactly that is, but they seem to have some kind of rivalry with the Godiva Security Organization, which again, I don't know what that is.
Ever have a class where you didn't attend any of the lectures, then showed up for a test and a bunch of the questions were on stuff only mentioned during class? That's what trying to understand the story is like.
Allegedly, inspiration was drawn from the manga/movie Toward the Terra, which had an anime series in production around the same time as this game. But aside from the whole Earth went to shit and we moved to space thing, there's not much common ground between them. Anyway, the game itself is not a shoot-'em-up. Drawing on games like Virtual On or Psychic Force, a Taito title which G.Rev's founders were still around to see the development of, WarTech Senko no Ronde is a hybrid shoot-'em-up fighting game, pitting 2 characters against each other and having them spam bullets, missiles, and lasers, and even flying up and hitting each other now and then until one person is left standing. Each character pilots a combat robot suit called a Rounder, which looks like something I'd get out of a capsule toy vending machine. Each has its own statistics for speed, defense, long-range attack strength, and close-range attack strength, as not at all confusingly indicated by the words fire and close. Every rounder also has a second cartridge which can be chosen, which gives slightly different stats and bullet patterns and alternate character portraits. Usually the change in stats and bullet patterns is negligible, unless you're playing as one of the few characters that has at least one absolutely god-awful stat. To be fair, they did an alright job making sure each character has different bullet patterns for their main and sub-weapon attacks, and even for some of the special moves. They even have one character who just fires a single powerful bullet at a time, and another character who won't hit a damn thing if he's aiming directly at his target. Speaking of, WarTech has 8 characters to choose from, each with a set of 4 or so costumes which you can't select in story mode because reasons. The oldest playable character is 25, which is about 40 in anime years, and half the characters are under 18 if you include the android Kuilan, who is supposedly a guy.
OK です。いつでも行けます。
Maybe he's just programmed to have a really high voice. It is a possibility. No. No, your character design should not remind me of Macaulay Culkin in Party Monster. Easily my favorite character is Fabian the Fast Man, solely because he's such a grumpy, short-fused asshole that he changed his original name from Fat Man to Fast Man. Most of the characters do have some background ties to other people within and outside of their security divisions, and in story mode they'll talk back and forth with each other during each fight. In theory this is a good idea, but think about this. Other fighting games have done stuff like this before, such as the Soul Calibur series, but how come they only did it before and after the fight instead of during it? Because you wouldn't be paying any attention to what they were saying. That's what ends up happening in WarTech, a game which has no English dub, and you won't be looking at the subtitles because you're much more focused on not getting shot. Music-wise, there's not much to say. Outside of 1 or 2 songs, I found the soundtrack to be pretty forgettable. It being covered up by various forms of gunfire, collisions, dialogue, and explosions most of the time didn't help matters. The exceptions include Ernula's music, just because it's so radically different from every other song on the soundtrack, and the ending theme, which I don't remember because it's memorable, but because you can't skip it. Fast forward, yeah. Skip, no. I'm gonna hear this easy listening music box mash up in my nightmares.
Is there a camera in here? Can we cut this part out? Oh yeah, sure. Just give me a second. Thanks.
Each rounder has a primary weapon and a sub-weapon, which the green or red circles around the rounder indicate if it's ready to fire or not, as well as a dash ability, a shield, and a total of 4 special moves called barrage techniques. The inputs for these techniques, while really simple, such as hitting left twice and then B, or clockwise circle B, felt pretty inconsistent. Anything more complicated than tapping a direction or two had about a 40% chance of not working, whether you're using the control stick or the awful 360 D-pad for inputs. Every rounder also has a few abilities beyond that, such as an anti-field, which wipes out all incoming attacks within a certain radius, and they can all go into overdrive for a short time each round, boosting your offense, defense, and charge gauge recovery while the armor gauge slowly decreases. Lastly, every rounder can enter a powerful state called Boss Mode, which stands for Booster of Overarmed Shell System.
That doesn't abbreviate to boss. Although I guess it is better than calling your superpowered game mechanic Boo-Ass Mode.
Are you saying boss or boo-ass?
Boss!
I was saying boo-ass. In addition to teleporting both fighters into a spiraling void, it changes your rounder for a brief period into a larger craft capable of stronger attacks that fill the screen with even more bullets, bombs, lasers, and whatever, but with worse maneuverability. This mode has its own yellow armor gauge, its size determined by how full the charge gauge is when you initiate it, and if that yellow bar is higher than your regular armor when boss mode ends, you'll regenerate that much armor, meaning you can go from having next to no armor left to a completely intact rounder. Timing when to use this is crucial to winning some fights, but usually it just ends up dragging out fights regardless of when it's used. Both fighters get 2 boss mode uses per round, and before you ask, no, you can't go into boss mode at the same time as someone else. All of these attacks take up energy from the charge gauge, shown below the armor gauge. This gauge can be raised and lowered by several different means.
Let's make a game out of this. I'll mention something you can do during a fight, and you try to guess whether it'll increase or decrease the charge gauge, starting with getting hit by close range attacks.
This decreases the charge gauge, although the instruction book says it greatly decreases it when in reality it doesn't lower it very much. Now how about successfully blocking enemy attacks with the shield? This also decreases the charge gauge. I guess it's to prevent turtling, but having a quote-unquote fighting game in which defensive play is outright punished seems a bit weird to me. Obviously landing attacks would increase the charge gauge, but what about getting hit by attacks? This increases the charge gauge as well. At times it felt like the charge gauge increased faster by taking hits than dishing them out. Last one. What about when you do absolutely nothing? This increases the charge gauge. Slowly, mind you, but it does cause it to go up.
Thanks for playing. Your prize is having to listen to me talk about this game for another... Jeez, I'm really going to talk that long?
As for melee attacks, they happen when you're within the weapon gauge circles by pressing the primary or sub-weapon buttons. Everyone does a 2 or 3 hit combo with the last hit knocking the opponent well out of melee range. You probably won't use this much as melee attacks are not just limited in scope, but incredibly awkward to do sometimes. There were several times where I did melee attacks by accident because they happen automatically when you're a certain distance away. Since both rounders automatically face each other all the time except when dashing, it's hard to get in close without dashing, which makes turning stiff and aiming difficult. It also doesn't help that all the areas you fight in are massive open circular spaces, giving your opponent ample opportunity to avoid any close-range encounters. If you miss with a melee attack, there's a massive cooldown before you can move again, and if you keep doing melee attacks, you'll just keep swinging at the air. The only reasons to use melee regularly are if you're playing as a character with a massive close-range combat stat, or you want to drain your opponent's charge gauge. By a little bit. It doesn't drain it by much. Oh, and this is also one of those games where you can move around before the fight and get in some cheap shots on your opponent right at the beginning, so there's that too. From a purely performance standpoint, the game runs... okay, I guess. It helps that the rounders, weapon effects, and to a degree the backgrounds have a simple graphical style to them. Still, there are moments where the game suffers from egregiously bad slowdown trying to handle everything on screen. Overall though, I had more problems with the weapon visuals. Sometimes due to the perspective or the camera zooming in or out too much, it got hard to tell what was going on, and I would just mash buttons until the proverbial smoke cleared. WarTech's other modes of play, aside from versus, consist of score attack and... score attack. This is basically story mode without the mid-fight banter and intros and with a scoring system. Landing attacks of any sort earns points, and after every victory you get a bonus for whatever extra time or life you had left. Unlike story mode, however, you don't get back your 2 uses of boss mode per fight. They only come back when you lose a fight, and you have 2 chances to win before having to use a continue, at which point your score resets to 0. There's not much to say about this really, so let's just move on to story mode structure. Aside from just fighting a selection of people in a certain order, after a while you encounter a giant warship. This is in effect the final boss, even though for several characters it isn't the last stage, which is kind of an anticlimax. Like if you went through Mega Man 3, defeated Dr. Wily, and then you had to fight Top Man, just because. This is the point where the game says, fuck it, it's not a fighting game anymore, as this is purely a shoot-'em-up stage, destroying a couple of sections of the ship before going after the core. The problem here is that as the fight goes on, the core's firing patterns progressively go straight down, which is where you'll be trying to hit the core. And you'll be using regular attacks primarily because you'll need your charge gauge to create anti-fields so you don't get blasted by walls of beams and bullets. It also doesn't help that many of the rounders are awkwardly shaped, so it can be tough to tell at times what exactly is and isn't your hitbox when trying to dodge all these shots. Oh, by the way, you can't use boss mode, just the anti-field that drains half the charge gauge. You'll also need the shield to lessen the damage taken from each wave of gunfire, and barrage techniques aren't worth it when they drain the charge gauge and take away your ability to defend yourself. Assuming you aren't a character with close range or melee barrage techniques, in which case you were shit out of luck to begin with.
One exception to this is Quillan, who has to fight an entirely different boss called the Squid. And if you're wondering why this video took so long to make, other than my recording equipment not cooperating, well, I quit playing WarTech for a couple of weeks solely because of this boss.
The Squid has a few different attack patterns. The first is spiraling bullet spam that fills the whole screen. The second is concentrated burst of bullet spam which end up covering about half the screen, and the last is a giant laser. That's all well and good, except I was playing as Quillan, the character with the worst defense and tied for the worst range attacks in the game. His melee attacks are useless against a ship which damages him if he touches it, and his high speed doesn't do much when everywhere I go there are bullets. Shooting the Squid does virtually no damage because you have to shoot past the arms and the rotating things on the side and hit the body of the ship. And if you don't blow a hole in its defenses and destroy it before the giant laser phase is over, it disappears and comes back with all of its arms intact. While the warship boss throws out the fighting aspect of the game, it's simple enough that someone who doesn't play many shoot-'em-ups, like, for example, me, can get into it and find a way past it. The Squid, though? This comes off as player hostile, especially when you do manage to expose the body and land enough shots to blow it up because, wait a minute, there's a second life bar up there. Enter Phase 2, the screen fills with bullets and lasers, and I die. Repeatedly. Having to go back to Phase 1 every time. Anyway, every character has their own ending, and completing story mode unlocks an extra called Original Story Mode, which is the story mode from the arcade version of the game. This is essentially the same except the endings. Instead of showing a few narrated images like before, it primarily consists of a wall of text and an image which do a worse job of explaining what the hell is going on.
There aren't exactly a whole lot of unlockables in general in this game. I mean, there's no extra characters, no extra stages, no extra modes. There's artwork, although most of the interesting artwork is already unlocked the moment you power up the game. But there's something else you can unlock in this game. Alternate story mode endings. And they have annoyingly specific and sometimes nonsensical conditions for unlocking them.
In order to unlock these extra endings for each character, certain events have to happen in each story mode playthrough. And they aren't the same for every character aside from having to beat story mode once already. Most of them involve listening to all of certain conversations in each fight. Yeah, those back and forths you didn't give a shit about? You have to listen to those all the way through in some levels to see the alternate ending, which sometimes means deliberately not attacking your opponent because you might win too fast and not finish the conversation, or it might get cut off from someone going into boss mode. For example, to get Karel's alternate ending, you have to beat story mode with him, beat story mode with Sakurako, then listen to all the dialogue from Fabian, Ansel, who is an NPC he talks to during the warship section, and Changpo. And Changpo has to go into boss mode during the fight. Even more ridiculous are Changpo's requirements. You have to clear story mode with her and Quillan, hear all the dialogue for Quillan, Mika, Karel, and Sakurako. Mika has to go into boss mode when you fight him, and you have to go into boss mode while fighting Sakurako. Getting these endings feels like I'm going for some absurd Steam achievement.
And in case you were wondering, the alternate story mode endings don't make any more sense than the regular ones.
I could go either way on this game. It's got a fairly unique concept, and it's a refreshing change of pace from prototypical fighting games. However, for this version there were some bizarre choices made with the game's mechanics and the structuring of the game itself, as evidenced by things like a general lack of modes of play, not originally being able to select a stage in versus mode, or having to patch the game twice to rebalance the characters, the first one happening because the characters didn't play like they did in the original arcade version. I did have some fun with it here and there, but ultimately it comes down to asking myself whether or not I was forcing myself to play this game solely to make this video. And unfortunately I was. If I were more of a shoot-'em-up fan, maybe I'd be more into it, but I can't see myself getting this for $5 Canadian. If this is your thing though and you're willing to do some importing, there was a follow-up to this game, Senko no Ronde Duo, or Disunited Order. It has a larger roster of characters, some tweaked game mechanics, a character assist system, and generally faster gameplay than the first title. Or if you have a PS4 and you're a total weeaboo, there's another game called Genso no Rondo, a fan-driven Toho project game which has a number of similar gameplay mechanics to Senko no Ronde.
And with that, I bid WarTech a fond adieu. And now I just wait for my hair color to come back. Hi, I'd like to set up a hair appointment. I should be free pretty much anytime tomorrow.